Doesn't matter. I say Höweler.
Hey Eric, how are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm good, yeah. Nice and warm in London. Tell us where you're calling from.
We're in Boston, downtown Boston, right by the Central Station.
So welcome to today's issue of Screen Time, sponsored by Enscape, where we speak to architects all around the world, including today Boston. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your architecture practice.
Sure. We're Hweler Yoon Architecture. We're in Boston. My partner is Meejin Yoon, who's also my wife. We met in undergrad back at Cornell in the late 80s. So we started a practice together in 2005 and have been working in Boston primarily, although I was in New York prior to that. We're both teachers. I teach at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and she, until recently, was the department head at MIT School of Architecture. So we're halfway in academia, halfway in practice, enjoying both.
And when you mentioned Meijin just now, you seem to be pointing off camera. Is she there in the room?
No, she's around the corner. Yeah, we're in our office, which used to be our home. So this used to be our living room, but it was a live workspace. So we sort of worked here, and then it became more work than live, and eventually we moved out.
So which part of Boston are you in?
Downtown. The Central Station is blocked that way, and Chinatown is right there.
And is everyone still behaving themselves and self-isolating and in lockdown in Boston?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the weather's gotten good, so you see more people in the park, but the streets are pretty empty. So it's a kind of strange way to experience urbanism.
And you seem quite lucky, given that your house was once an architecture studio, so working from home doesn't seem to be presenting too much of a problem to you.
Yeah, no, we're teaching online as well, and we see our students sort of zooming in, and they're sitting on their beds and there's couches, and sometimes I Zoom with my employees and they're in the closet. I mean, it's really pushed work into the home, which I think is something that we all need to think about. On the other hand, it's something we've been training for a while. I mean, we've been doing Zoom calls with China. We've been working from home or working remotely. So in a way, we're lucky that it hit now as opposed to 10 years ago, where we wouldn't have been as easy to shift online.
It's interesting that, because I keep thinking about that. What if it has happened a long time ago, before the digital age? I mean, first of all, telling people that they needed to lock down in the first place would have been a bit harder, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I remember the previous global traumas, like the Gulf War, for example, the only real way to get information was CNN and those rolling news channels. There was just one way of getting the information. So you'd have the TV on, and that would tell you everything, but it was very much a one-way delivery of information. You couldn't check whether that was actually happening by WhatsApping someone in downtown Baghdad or anything like that. It's a sort of completely different situation now.
Yeah, it is a kind of global present that's been created through media. It's true. I mean, I grew up in South America, where even to make a long distance phone call, we had to drive somewhere to get to a telephone to call, internationally. So it has changed tremendously.
Actually, having said that, in the early days of Dezeen's been going 13 and a half years now. And I remember the first summer of Dezeen, when it was still just me. If we went on holiday somewhere, there would not be Wi-Fi. So I'd have to drive. I remember being in Tuscany once in a little village, and having to drive half an hour to the nearest town that had a Wi-Fi cafe, and then wait, because there was only one computer. Wait until someone else had finished, and then log on and post something and update comments and things like that. So we're talking like the olden days, as if they're 20, 30 years ago, but it's not actually that long ago, is it?
The days were just yesterday. Now it's interesting how it's accelerating everything.
And just one more question before you move into your presentation. So you spend, what proportion of your time is spent teaching? What proportion of it is with doing this architecture studio?
I say I teach 2 days a week, and I work 5 days a week. So, the balance is in the office. I am a full-time faculty member, so that does require other things like committee work and admin thesis students and so on. Yeah, I teach about, yeah, it doesn't add up. It's not like 50-50. It's like 70-70 or something. But it does keep us on our toes.
And which of those two activities, teaching and architecture, is the most problematic in a lockdown situation?
Huh. Interesting. I mean, I like to run my office like an academic studio. So, you know, I aspire to the kind of intellectual kind of aspect to design. So I think they're quite similar. The difference, of course, is that projects have clients and they have certain schedules. Students are also on a schedule, so you have commitments that are sort of locked in and flexibility in between. But I aspire to sort of push those two realms together. We practice like an academic studio. We teach with a kind of rigor and a kind of professionalism, I think. But they're both challenged. They both sort of had surprising discoveries. You know, lecturing.
I suppose the outcome of education is qualification, whereas the outcome of architecture is building. So I can imagine the design part of it is relatively straightforward. But what about actually building? I mean, have sites ground to a standstill?
Yeah. Yeah, we started a project right before the lockdown. We drove like 5 sheet piles and then the mayor put the city on hold. So we've got a project at MIT, which has also been under construction for about 5 months, and that also went, you know, cold. But we are expecting to re-enter. In fact, Boston started construction again this week, and we expect Cambridge to start again next week. So things are coming back slowly with more care.
Great. Well, why don't you fire up your presentation and show us what you've been up to?
Sure. So I prepared a bit of a visual story, if you will. Can you see that all right?
Yeah.
Okay, so just as a kind of intro to our studio, like I said, it used to be our home, so it has a kind of homey feel, even though we have a lot of colleagues that come in to work every day. We also have a fabrication shop, which we like to test things, prototype things. We did invest in a CNC mill, so a lot of things we can actually test sort of full scale and yeah, real materials. One of our earliest projects is from 2001, the defensible dress, which is something that Meijin designed when she was a faculty member at MIT. And what it does is sort of uses an infrared sensor to sort of detect if someone's coming close to your body. And then there are these quills that stand up to sort of define a personal space. So early on, I think we were interested in technology and cultural, you know, spatial patterns, but also how you can use other means to define a kind of a space, an architecture, a kind of intimate architecture of the body. And early on, we started getting involved with microcontrollers and infrared sensors and things that we weren't taught in architecture school, but we sort of had a hunch that was something important for architecture to think about is technology, electronics, behavior, scripting. In 2004, we did this installation for the Athens Olympics, which was a field of fiber optic lights that responded to you as you moved through it. So early kind of immersive environments, responsive architectures. But what we learned was that this was completely dematerialized. We used fiber optics, you know, transparent materials, electronics, not your typical kit of parts. And what we started to think about was, how can we think of sound and light as kind of the kind of enhanced palette for architecture? We talked about media as a material for architecture. So early experiments in kind of light and sound installations as an alternative architecture or kind of enhanced architecture. A few years later, we installed this project in Boston called Swing Time, which is a set of large interactive swings. The swings have microcontrollers and accelerometers so that if you swing, it changes color. A very simple idea to sort of reinforce or incentivize certain behaviors. We did notice very quickly how it's not just kids that like to swing, it's grown-ups, and everybody, you know, enjoys a kind of playfulness. And this was also kind of an extension of our early projects, thinking about how do we sort of amplify public space? How do we use technology to sort of reinforce behavior and playfulness as a kind of quality that makes place happen. This is something that we sort of fabricated ourselves. We use kind of rotomolding technology, sort of using different kinds of fabrication techniques, and we really enjoy the kind of process of building, not just the kind of products of building. We noticed very quickly that people use the swings in surprising ways. It always surprises us how people use spaces. And we started to think about human behavior as something that could be reinforced, amplified, designed. We came up with a bunch of do's and don'ts for the swing, which was kind of fun to think about, like what kind of behaviors do we want to reinforce, complement, amplify, and what behaviors do we not want? Not just, no rough play, but also, behave yourself, become a kind of civil sort of protagonist, don't behave in ways that are kind of antisocial. A few years later, we designed a memorial at MIT for a police officer that was killed there. This was a commission where we proposed a kind of five-sided figure with a sort of what we call a conspicuous absence at its center. We wanted people to feel like something was missing, and we wanted to show the structure of this memorial. So it's made of solid stone. It's really a kind of five-sided arch or a five-sided vault. And here we sort of shifted from a kind of media as material to material after media. So thinking about digital fabrication as a kind of a way to sort of manage material, how to cut material with a kind of precision that only digital fabrication could provide. So instead of simply fiber optics and lights, we sort of got back into the kind of traditional medium of architecture, which is maybe more traditional physical, tangible materials, but then somehow altered through the kind of the tools and the instruments of digital practice. This project did sort of expose us to a lot of digital fabrication techniques in the service of creating something, I think, powerful in a kind of public space on campus at MIT. A couple years on, we did our first sort of major building in China, in Chengdu. It's a cultural center where the client asked for something very local. He asked, where's the Chinese feeling in this project? And we weren't sure what he was talking about, but we did design a building that used traditional materials, this kind of local brick, in a maybe unconventional way. So we asked all the bricks to be set on the kind of cardinal direction. So it produces a kind of texture on any wall that's sort of deviating from the cardinal directions. And that simple detail of the kind of textured brick that's sort of set by hand by a Chinese mason, I think produced a condition that we thought sort of tied a kind of global practice to a kind of hyper-local condition. And it did produce the effect for the client of a kind of situated architecture, contemporary Chinese architecture. I put this image in here. This is an image that I posted a few weeks ago about PPE. The pandemic hit, we were sort of sitting around wondering what can we do, and friends of ours are starting to make things, and we thought, how can we do something? How do we get involved? And so a simple 3D printer and a plastic sheet, helped to produce something useful for the first responders and doctors. And this turned into an effort that led to a PIH, a patient isolation hood, where I collaborated with a group of designers all over the country, working collaboratively on a project to isolate patients who might be COVID positive and allow doctors to perform sort of sensitive operations. And I think this project obviously comes from a familiarity with materials and digital fabrication techniques. And so our interest in plastics and in forming and folding, I think, helped us to sort of create something that was actually, impactful. So I think it reminded us of the agency of design in this sort of very troubling time, where everyone's sitting at home feeling helpless. How can designers actually still contribute meaningfully to help with this condition? Lastly, I wanted to show a project that is sort of looking forward. We are building what looks like a yellow submarine for Philadelphia. It is a project called Float Lab, and it's again sort of stretching the boundaries of what architectural practice might be. Is it naval architecture? Is it a kind of art installation? it's intended as a kind of outdoor classroom for Bartram's Garden, which is a botanical garden in Philadelphia. The idea is to bring Philadelphians back to the river, to have them experience the river from this kind of semi-submerged vantage point, and sort of reintroduce them to a kind of urban nature that's in their backyard, but they may have sort of overlooked or forgotten. And so I think what some of these projects have in common is this kind of question of design and human behavior. You know, how does the human aspect impact both questions of how do you stand on a subway platform next to somebody, how close is too close, questions of human labor, how do we think about the guy setting the bricks or the girl setting the bricks. And ultimately this question of the pandemic, I think, does raise questions of how do we design not just buildings and cities, but actually behaviors. You know, social conduct is part of what I think architecture as a kind of public art can do, reinforcing certain behaviors. And bigger questions of the environment. How do we sort of encourage people to behave in a way that acknowledges a kind of ecological consciousness? So this float lab is a modest way to sort of introduce people to an urban nature such that they're aware of their own ecological footprint. So we call it a kind of eco-literacy. But ultimately, I think it comes down to human behavior, and that's what we're sort of focused on as designers. That's it. That was my last slide.
Well, I was just waiting for you to unshare the screen so I can see.
Oh, sorry.
So thanks for that. Eric, you didn't show that many buildings. It was mostly non-building scale architecture.
Yeah. I mean, we are doing buildings. We're doing a lot of work, both in Boston and in China. I wanted to sort of focus in on certain kinds of projects that did sort of have to do a lot with questions of human behavior. In the early days, we started primarily with installations and public art projects like White Noise, White Light in Athens and Swing Time. We have slowly shifted towards sort of more physical structures. But I think we pursue architectural projects with similar kinds of, I think, thoughtfulness or care in terms of how details come together, how materials are sort of configured.
And the defensible dress that you showed back at the beginning, I mean, presumably that was not originally conceived as something for social distancing. What was the behavior that was trying to, you're talking about designing behavior, was that sort of a stay away from the lady kind of thing, or what was the behavior that was supposed to address?
Yeah, Meejin grew up in the States, but she's also worked in Korea. She was noticing in Korea, people stand very close. You know, it's a very dense city, and sort of questions of personal space are different, you know, culture to culture. So when she came back to MIT and she was working on this wearable, she thought, how could I sort of reinscribe a kind of architectural sort of boundary? Obviously, it would be different for different contexts, but I found it kind of highly resonant with our contemporary moment, you know, where the kind of 2 meter sort of boundary is something that is unspoken, and but it's sort of implicit in how we sort of signal to each other. So I thought it resonated again with this moment. So trying to tie it together.
To make it 2 meters or 6 feet, as the Anglo-Saxons say, you need slightly longer spikes, wouldn't you?
You do. In fact, you need, you know, because they might be, you know, you can't assume that they've got a similar dress on. So, you know, we do need, you know, longer spikes.
And also the way that the spikes rose up was very unthreatening. It could have been maybe more effective than sort of like.
Yeah. I mean, you know, what can we learn from the porcupine, right? That sort of amplifies its volume, or a cat even, you know, a cat sort of signals like that.
It's funny because it reminded me of when I was choosing which course to go and do 3D design at when I was, I don't know, 18. Me and some friends, we went up to Manchester Polytechnic to look at the 3D design course there. We sat down with this tutor who was this amazing guy, and he was saying that he'd set his students to design a parking meter. And he said that, you know, normal parking meter, you put the money in, and when the money runs out, nothing much happens apart from someone comes and gives you a power ticket. He said, that's not enough of a disincentive. He said, what if the parking meter hammer came out of the parking meter and started smashing your car? It's always stuck in my mind, like ways of channeling behavior, not through gentle nudging, but through aggression.
Yeah. Well, I think it's both, carrot and stick, we talk about pushing, technological pushes or technological pulls, for innovation. We also talk about, did the American suburb happen because Eisenhower, implemented the Highway Act and sort of top down created an infrastructure for suburbia, or was it because people really wanted that suburban house? And the desire for that kind of idea of an American dream, was it pulled or was it pushed? It was probably a bit of both. And so when we think about human behavior and design, we want to think about, the things that people will desire for themselves, and then, providing those alternative, futures that that they could aspire to.
And extrapolating that to what's going on now, what do you think will happen in terms of architectural space and urban space as a result of coronavirus? I mean, how do we strike the balance between encouraging people to social distance in London, North London parks on a hot day, for example, or enforcing that? And what about the implications for homes and offices and things like that? Will there need to be new legislations that are draconian and enforced on people, or can architects nudge people towards behaving in a way that protects them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we've been doing work in China, and we're in touch with our Chinese, clients and colleagues, and they somehow managed through a very, robust kind of authoritarian sort of mechanism to compartmentalize and contain, and in a way we look at that and we're like, wow, that's impressive. It wouldn't work here because you could never tell people what to do the way the Chinese government does. I'd like to think that we could, through design, sort of achieve similar outcomes, but it hasn't proved to be the case. I mean, people are not following the guidelines. There's even a kind of backlash, a kind of strange backlash to some sort of basic guidelines about protection and distancing. I do think the role of design after COVID will change. I think we are going to sort of reimagine many things that we took for granted before. Lots of habits that we just did because we did them. Now we're going to do them either out of necessity or out of sort of deliberateness. And I think that's kind of exciting. Thinking about cities and public space. I mean, until there's a kind of vaccine, it's all about space and behavior, right? So how do we think about space and time differently as we go forward?
And do you have any concrete examples of that, how that might manifest itself through design?
We've been thinking about the defensible dress and other things that might be more subtle, things that sort of define a kind of boundary, kind of reinscribe a kind of spatial limit. I mean, the question is, can we still have the kind of social that we kind of crave and the distant? Someone said, well, it's not really social distancing. We're still going to be social. It's really physical distancing that we're, being social while being physically remote. I think cities are starting to think about how to re-compartmentalize the street. Maybe to encourage different kinds of behaviors, we need a different apportionment of vehicular, pedestrian. This is something that's been in the works for a while, but I think it's going to really sort of take over now that we need more space for social distancing. Sidewalks just aren't wide enough for that. So the mayor of Boston announced a number of streets that will become pedestrianized, different ways of using the park. I think it's going to be a kind of really interesting time to rethink cities and streets through this disruption that we always talk about, but now we've got.
It is interesting, the kind of the new terminology that we've got used to very quickly, like social distancing, for example, which I was waiting in line at a shop yesterday, and there was a sign about their social distancing measures, and I was thinking, this is anti-social distancing. It's the opposite of social. You call it physical distancing, which is true as well, because we've found other ways of being social. But it's about in a shop, you don't know the person in front of you, so there's no social relationship there. It's just a physical distance. But are you saying that things like the dress imply that the distancing could be enforced not through architectural measures like separate lifts or barriers between the cars and the pedestrians, but through maybe more subtle or even less subtle defensive measures that people carry around with them?
Yeah, I think, we're constantly communicating, right? Even with a mask on, you walk down the street, you make eye contact with someone, in a split second, you've communicated something. And I, not that everybody in Boston would sort of wave and say hi, it wasn't that kind of town, but I found that behaviors have changed. There's a kind of inevitable kind of cautiousness, and that's unfortunate. Everyone is perceived as a threat, and so we are communicating through what we wear and how we, there's so much gestural communication. I think architecture communicates, we communicate through our design, and how do we use different cues? It could be subtle things like light and sound, like the white noise, white light project. It could be physical things like the dress, or, chalk lines on the floor, or, different patterns are going to emerge. And I think those need to be designed. So I think there's a tremendous world of opportunity for kind of recasting our kind of urban spaces in this moment.
You made an interesting comment before we started on the live part of the talk, when you said that, was it a deaf friend of yours said that she can't lip read through Zoom because the technology is glitchy, and although you get enough information to understand what someone's saying, he or she doesn't get enough lip movement information. What was the story?
Yeah, at Harvard, we were talking about technology and the capacity to still lecture and connect with students. We've been thinking about virtual pedagogy and how we can do things now that we couldn't do before. I noted that in a lecture course of 70 students, because they're Zoomed, they're so close. Whereas in the real lecture hall, they'd be in the back of the hall in the dark, and I wouldn't know their names. Now they're right here, their name is written underneath, I can call on them. So there's a kind of new intimacy to Zoom lectures that wasn't there before. My colleague, Michael Hayes, noted that, this one student had said that through lip reading, it does require high fidelity sort of visual cues that just aren't transmitted through Zoom because the image refresh rate isn't there. So very interesting commentary. We think our technology is enabling so much, but there's still kind of pitfalls within it. So I think that, there's still room for improvement there. I do think as we get more remote, the way we meet in person will be different. And we need to design that sort of very conscious sort of co-presence. How do we really come together in meaningful ways if we have to be apart for so much?
I imagine that somebody's already working on an app though, because if the audio is coming through and is good enough to be transcribed by AI software, which is a tool that I'm using all the time now, then it could probably figure out how to turn that into better real-time mouth gestures.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I mean, I'd like to know more about it. But it does, yeah, I think it ultimately comes down to how do we communicate either in liveness or in remoteness, through technological interfaces.
Let's talk about the picture of you wearing the face shield, because I saw that picture on your Facebook, and that led to me having a crash course, first of all, in the design of PPE equipment.
Right.
And second of all, in ways of getting information very, very quickly from people on the other side of the world. So tell us about that project. So you put a picture of you up wearing a face shield that you'd made yourself. Tell us how you got involved in that project, because I think, speaking for myself, I didn't even know what PPE was before then. I didn't know what a face shield was. I knew what a mask was because everyone was talking about masks, but I already knew about masks. But tell us, how did you get involved in that project? And how much impact did it have? And where is it? What's the legacy of it?
Yeah, sure. So, I think when this thing hit, everyone was watching the news and everyone was hearing about how unprepared we were, how hospitals were running out of basic, safety gear. And we all felt pretty helpless. And I heard about 3D printing masks, and I thought, well, masks seem fairly technical, right? That's a kind of medical device. I wouldn't want to risk, something homemade, even digitally fabricated. But Jenny Sabin, a colleague from Cornell, had reached out saying, we're 3D printing shields, not the respiratory bit, but the kind of visual bit. Would you be involved? And through Meejin, who's the dean at Cornell, we shared files and fired up the 3D printer, and I was still skeptical, I have to say. But when I assembled one, and it was very simple, a kind of clear plastic sheet from a kind of, an A4 kind of report cover with a 3-hole punch, it produced a very good shield that was surprisingly easy to assemble, out of sort of parts that we sort of had lying around the office. So at that point, I realized that this could have an impact. It really, was possible to do and have an impact. So we started printing, all the time, and produced, lots and lots of shields, and we've been sort of mailing them out. And that sort of led to a kind of a different project, the PIH project, the patient isolation hood, where because of the PPE efforts, we thought, hey, maybe we do know something. Maybe we can get involved. Maybe we can make a difference. And so I heard about a group that was meeting online to talk about these devices that were desperately needed in hospitals. So again, I also had no experience with sort of medical design or kind of safety parameters, but we realized that the things that they were looking for, basically, envelopes, were things that architects work with all the time. We define boundaries for buildings, we define HVAC systems, and, suction and negative pressure. And so it was like a small building. It's an intimate architecture that sits over the patient's head, that has a ductwork that provides suction to remove the kind of contaminated air. So we realized that we have skills that we can apply, and we have some agency, which was incredibly powerful realization, that we're not just sitting at home watching the news and worrying, but we can actually contribute meaningfully through a kind of network of designers that were committed to doing something about it.
And with both of those projects, the face shields and the patient isolation hoods, are they still being developed? Is there still a need for the face shields and the patient isolation hoods? That sounds like something that could be very, very useful in a lot of hospitals around the world for a very, very long time.
Yeah, the face shields, I think, are still in demand in some places. It was something that took the industry by surprise, and so there wasn't enough, supply. I think as industry sort of ramped up to provide that, I think, individuals printing things maybe isn't as necessary. Although I still get requests for face shields, people asking, can you send me some? In terms of the patient isolation hood, that is something that will continue to be used. At the moment, when we were designing it, there was an idea that the peak would happen on April 18th, and we needed to meet that peak. But the curve is going to continue down, and during that multiple month period, the hoods would still be useful. So we are still working on those. They're still going through the process of validation and testing. How can they be sanitized for reuse or else made disposable? And so that's ongoing. And as I understand it, it's still kind of critical necessity. There are emails coming in from doctors saying, if I had this right now, I would use it. And so surgeries are still happening. The number of patients is declining, but the demand is still there. Partially because the supply was zero. There was no comparable product, which is amazing to think that the medical industry, which is so sophisticated, still has blind spots like that. A device that's just, was never needed before.
And what I was hearing from people I was speaking to in the medical professions was, first of all, that the pandemic had thrown up, as you said, the gaps in the equipment that they had, but that also the equipment that they do have is so badly designed. And working with people like you, they suddenly realized, oh my God, things could be so much better. Not just new equipment that we need for this specific crisis, but just all the stuff that clutters up the ER rooms and the wards and everything like that. I mean,
yeah.
this is an amazing opportunity for the medical profession to come together with creative people like you, without the patent guys and the lawyers and the testing people getting in the way.
Yeah, no, it was quite eye-opening for us, and I think for the doctors to work with designers in this real-time scenario, right? Because otherwise it would be done by a company and it would be like a 3-year project, and it would take a lot of time and there wouldn't be this lively back and forth. I think what happened in this instance was a kind of real-time, we would zoom into a meeting with 20 healthcare providers, and they were in their scrubs, wearing their face masks, looking at the design, saying, well, I would need to reach in from this side, could you make an opening on that side? We're getting real feedback in real time. And I think as design educators, we often don't think about the user or the client or the public in that kind of immediate way. And so imagine you're designing something for a client and they're zooming in as you're working and giving you feedback. I mean, that was a kind of a real eye-opening moment for all involved. And so I said, I'd love to teach a studio, going forward, maybe with an interdisciplinary team, and so we work with not just doctors, but part of the team were industrial designers thinking about, detailing that was more coming from fashion and outdoor equipment. So it was a spectacular effort that I think produced a unique outcome. So definitely lessons learned there.
And do you think that will happen? Will you lead a course in what's that kind of hospital equipment design, or what?
I still have to pitch it to my chair, but I'd love to do something on environmental health, safety, healthy spaces. I think that's a huge realm that's sort of underexplored. It doesn't have to be necessarily equipment. I'd love to do something at different scales, like wearable, intimate, and architecture. And I think that's something that in our practice, we also try to keep that full range, from the body to the building, to the city.
These crises that seem to be happening every year or so now, the refugee crisis and coronavirus crisis. What's notable is how the architecture and design community immediately starts to want to get involved. With the patient isolation hood and things like that, there are definitely ways that designers can add value or come up with new ideas that weren't there before. But also, I'm a little bit tired of getting mask designs sent to me by designers. Is there a point at which people should just stay out of areas they don't really understand, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, we like to say we like to cross disciplinary boundaries, and we're trained as architects, but why are we designing a submarine or a wearable? We're trespassing into other disciplines. On the other hand, those sort of border crossings are productive, I think, for us and for those other disciplines. So we'll continue to do that. It doesn't mean we don't recognize expertise. I think that's an important point to make. We encourage interdisciplinary design work, but we know when we don't know. And so we reach out to experts, whether it's a kind of an electronics engineer or a naval architect. We don't want this float lab to sink. So we've got a really great naval architect sort of doing the buoyancy calculation. So we enjoy the trespass, but we definitely acknowledge expertise, and we know when we need help. So, I mean, for us, it's always exciting to work with other designers from other fields to do things that have been kind of unprecedented.
I've got a question come through from Natalie Hurlston. What do you think the role of architecture students should be during the crisis? We've talked about how professionals have stepped up, but what about students?
Yeah, I mean, I because I teach full time, the line between the kind of professional and the kind of academic is kind of blurry for me. I mean, students are the ones that are pushing for this kind of relevance. They're the ones that are asking for courses on climate change. They're the ones that are demanding a kind of pedagogical response to the crisis. So we are excited by the kind of ideas that our students have, that our employees have, that every member of the studio brings. So we think students are equally engaged and equally desiring of the kind of impact that we're trying to achieve in our studio. So we feed off of that kind of energy, and we sort of fold it right in. In terms of pedagogy, I mean, all schools are contemplating, how do we reopen? How do we redesign the experience of teaching in a mixture of remote and co-present? And so I think there's a lot of design work in terms of designing pedagogies that's ongoing and is going to continue to evolve. So I see students as really the kind of engine for a lot of this kind of innovative thinking, because they're demanding these responses.
And how are the students responding to the remote teaching? I mean, it's a good point, actually, because most of the conversations I've been having with people comes from speaking to faculty members about getting back to school. But what do the students want? Are they happy having their lessons from the cupboard, as you mentioned before, or are they desperate to get back to campus?
Yeah, I mean, we've been having a lot of virtual town hall meetings with the students at Harvard, and listening to what their anxieties are, what their demands are. They're asking for clarification on what school is going to look like in the fall, if we can reopen, what that's going to be like, how we're going to make adjustments. So I think all parties are super invested in this in terms of teaching and learning. But I think we're going to need to figure things out over the summer, but also kind of be agile enough to make changes as we go. I mean, last semester was kind of remoteness by emergency, and next semester is going to be remoteness by design. Similar constraints, but we're going to be much more deliberate about how we teach in the fall than we were in the spring, where we sort of had to evacuate at a moment's notice. So I think there will be exciting opportunities to sort of reimagine things that are possible now that weren't really possible then, because of constraints or because of habit. We had so many kind of habits about how we taught, but this has sort of blown up, and now we can sort of rebuild a kind of pedagogy that is maybe more deliberate. So I'm excited about it. I think we're gonna still do great stuff.
And do you have any predictions about what kind of changes will come out of this?
I mean, I think if we are still teaching in a kind of hybrid mode of remote and co-present, how we come together will be very deliberate, right? If we were coming together 3 days a week because the schedule said we were going to come together 3 days a week, now we might come together less often at different intervals, but more deliberately. So I think it'll change the nature of like one-on-one interactions in physical space. It'll change the kind of granularity of education. I feel like the kind of a course with 30 students is going to be broken up into smaller chunks for more kind of one-on-one, more intimacy. And I think lecture courses will continue to function, pretty well online. But I think the kind of in-between scale, I think, is going to get sort of redefined by the chunks of human interaction. So more granularity, more intimacy, more one-on-one, more deliberateness in those one-on-one interactions. So I think that's an ongoing design project that I think that we're taking on.
And final question, Eric. I've been sitting here looking at you, but also at all the things in the background there. Can you tell me what some of those things are?
Well,
the big, that's one of the swings in the background.
Swings there. Yeah.
I didn't, because your shoulder was hiding it. I thought it was some weird skyscraper with a hole in the middle. Is that a working model?
Yeah, no, this is an actual piece. We prototype things, we hang them up in our studio, and then we test them. They're quite comfortable, so every once in a while I sit in it, and my daughter loves it. So yeah, no, it's fun to have a studio that's also a bit of a museum, a bit of a kind of cabinet of curiosities. So.
Are you going to demonstrate the swing to us?
I could. I don't know if you can see that much. But...
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah.
Range of motion here.
Good. The lights didn't come on, but don't worry.
Oh, yeah. No, this one's got a battery, so it needs to be charged.
And then what's that thing on the table? It looks like some kind of star-shaped thing. Is that a nut bowl, or is it some kind of architecture?
It would make a good nut bowl. This was a competition for a bridge in Shanghai that we didn't win, but it was a great concept for a bridge. A bridge not as a connection from A to B, but almost a destination unto itself. So this is a park in Shanghai where the expo site was in 2010. It's being reimagined as a park, and we're trying to make bridges that were places too, not just infrastructure.
And now it's a nut bowl, but you need a lot of nuts to fill that.
Yeah, it's a nice centerpiece. You can put stuff in it.
And almost everything behind you is white, apart from that little yellow mug down. I noticed the water-bound project that you showed was also a similar yellow. So is that your new thing, yellow?
My daughter was asking, why is the submarine yellow? And I said, well, there was a song about that. And she's like, is that why you did it that way? I'm like, I don't know. I guess yellow does get your attention. Right? Why was the yellow submarine yellow? It was communicating something.
Anyway, Eric, it's been brilliant talking to you. A lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for all your help with the early stories about the face mask, the face shield, and the isolation hood. That was a real eye-opener for me. And like I said, it was a real crash course in PPE, but also I think it was my first Zoom, and the speed of the response. It was really exciting. Looking back on that period when we were kind of all confronted with a brand new situation, and just trying to get the information out there and help everyone was really something. So thanks for being my doorway into that world.
Yeah, well, thanks for the conversation. It's been a lot of fun, and hopefully we keep talking.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. All right. See you, Marcus. Bye.